I have not. I will never take a knee. I will never in my life take a knee and disrespect our flag, disrespect our national anthem. I love my country.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
This is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Brandon Tatum. Brandon Tatum is a former police officer and a Conservative commentator. We're going to be talking about the Black Lives Matter protests, the death of George Floyd, and the idea of white privilege and whether we live in a racist society. You can watch Burning Questions every single week, following the link in the description, and I hope you enjoy today's version. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Are you a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Am I a supporter?
Correct.
No, I'm not.
Why not?
Well, because I don't think that the intentions or the spirit behind Black Lives Matter is actually effective, and they're being genuine about what their approach is. I haven't seen not one legitimate result that have come from Black Lives Matter, the movement, or any of the activism that has came forth in America. And if you ask me, I think they've been more destructive, more counterproductive than they have been doing anything positive in America.
The actual phrase Black Lives Matter, I think pretty much everyone can agree with that, right? So is there a distinction between the phrase and the kind of goals of the movement and the people involved in the movement and what you were mentioning just there?
Yeah, to me, it seems like a racist or a prejudiced overtone to even suggest that Black Lives Matter. And the reason why is because everybody matters. You shouldn't isolate one group and say, let's emphasize that these individuals matter more than anybody else, or to highlight that. I get some of the idea behind it, that people may feel like Black people are being held behind, or if that's their sentiment. I get it, but I think it does more harm by isolating one racial group and therefore leaving out others. And I'll tell you this, in America, if a white group were to say white lives matter, people will be open arms and have a problem with that, saying that this is racially biased. So I think just the title in and of itself, Black Lives Matter, I don't really think that they should have went down that path because it makes them look like they're racially prejudiced. But I think they should have said all lives matter, which is saying that Black lives are just as equal to other lives, not necessarily that Black lives are better or should be emphasized at a higher rate.
I suppose the argument that they would put back to you would be that obviously we've seen a series of Black people being killed by cops. George Floyd is just the latest of many over the past few years and decades. Therefore, they're saying, well, look, there's clearly some people out there in America and all around the world who don't actually believe that Black lives do matter, so that we've actually got to go and point out that actually, in fact, they do matter, and therefore, we've got to go out and protest. So what would you say to that argument that, look, they're just pointing out that there's an injustice going on?
Yeah, I mean, we should look at facts. And if we were going to have a conversation at any point, we need to start from a point of being equal, treating everybody with respect, and then we can come to the table. It should not be one side bashing the other side, thinking that we're going to accomplish anything. Black Lives Matter as a organization or an approach, it comes across as disingenuous when you look at their arguments, because they're basing their arguments and evaluation on Black lives. It appears to be only when a Black person dies at the hands of police. When you look at the overwhelming majority of Black lives being lost through abortion, being lost through bad health, heart disease, and other things, including Black on Black violence, they're MIA. They're not present. So it appears to be that their argument becomes disingenuous because they're not worried about all Black lives. And just as an example, just recently, this past weekend in one city, in one state, and it's obviously one part of one city, we had 25 African-American people killed over the weekend in Chicago, Illinois. I mean, that's more people killed in one weekend than have been killed when you look at respect to unarmed Black people who have been killed by police officers in last year and this year combined. Actually, it's been double the police fatalities of unarmed Black people in 2019 and 2020. So when you see things like that and you never hear Black Lives Matter even mention these victims' names, you become very suspicious of their motives.
I'm keen to talk about one specific black life, and then there's a whole series of deaths that I also want to go into. And this is obviously a very tragic and sad thing to talk about. But the death of George Floyd caused international outcry. What is your take on his death?
Well, I think the international outcry, in my personal opinion, is unfortunate because I think people are more sheep than they are actually revealing the truth and being or acting in a logical way. Because this is one death, one person at the hands of potentially four other officers. I think his death, as it relates to what the police officer did, I think it was unjust. Now, in the court of law in the United States of America, you're innocent until proven guilty. So I can't establish any guilt, but based on what I saw, it appeared that the officer acted inappropriately, which led to George Floyd's death. Now, George Floyd wasn't completely innocent in a sense that he wasn't just walking down the street and the cops just ran up and beat him down and killed him. He was involved in criminal activity, which necessitated police to respond. He was attempting to pay for something with fraudulent money. He had also been ingesting or taking methamphetamine, probably laced with fentanyl, at a rate that could have been fatal in and of itself. And he resisted arrest of police officers when they tried to put him in the back of the police car. So he had actions that led him down the path of being exposed to an officer that I believe acted inappropriately, which resulted in George Floyd's death.
I suppose all of those actions are obviously, you can point them out, but none of them can be justified for what the police officer did, in that he put his knee on this guy's neck for about 9 minutes whilst he was shouting, "I can't breathe." So surely those actions, whilst you can point them out, that they can't justify what the police officer did.
Right. They cannot justify, and we're talking two separate situations, right? What the police officer did is unacceptable. But I think when we look at the situation, we need to figure out on both sides, how do we make this better? How do we prevent this from happening in the future as a society? And there are obvious things that can be done on the police side as far as training, as far as holding police officers accountable for things like this. We see that on the police side. We also need to look at the public side and say, well, how do you avoid getting into a position where you run into a potential bad officer and end up getting killed unjustifiably? So I think that it's invaluable that we look at both sides and figure out how, as a citizen, can we avoid getting in these situations, and how, as a police officer, can we avoid, and a police department, can we avoid this happening at the hands of one of our police officers?
Now, you've obviously mentioned there black on black crime, as you say, 25 people dying in Chicago over the weekend. Yet the death of George Floyd to this police officer, it caused, as I said earlier, international outcry, and it really released a depth of emotion that I've never seen in my lifetime. Even in Britain, in London, where I'm living at the moment, we've seen thousands of people go out and protest, almost like there's no pandemic on anymore. We've seen statues being torn down. We've seen riots and looting in America and all around the world. I want to know why. What do you think is the reason that George Floyd sparked such outcry? And why did the deaths of those people in Chicago at the weekend not cause similar disdain and similar protests?
Well, I think that when you look at the video, it's so gruesome, it's so bad that it will cause an emotional reaction. Now, I don't think anybody that watched that video, watching a man die with a police officer's knee on his neck, wouldn't have an emotion. I had an emotional experience. It was hard for me to watch. I don't want to watch it more than a few times. But I think people are using George Floyd's death as an excuse to accomplish other agendas. And the reason why I say that is because their outrage and their protest isn't consistent with police brutality and trying to actually fix it. When you see people protesting in other countries, you have to ask some of these activists the question of, do you even really know what happened? Are you aware of laws and regulation and uses of force in the United States of America? Or you're just watching a video that makes you feel emotional? And then you see people tearing down statues. Now, what does a statue have to do with George Floyd? What does burning down buildings and looting in the United States of America, and I think we've seen it overseas as well, but what does looting and stealing property and murdering other people in protest have to do with George Floyd. And George Floyd's family didn't even come out and protest and weren't even violent. They made a statement on the news that they should stop all of the protests and violence because that's not what their brother or their son, George Floyd, would have wanted. So when you see people acting in a way that's inconsistent with the family, inconsistent with police brutality activism, you have to then ask yourself the question, what is the underlying issue here, and what is the motive from some people who are using George Floyd's death as an excuse to overthrow a government they dislike or to create complete anarchy?
Now, I want to get onto the violent protests and the looting in a minute, but just for now, let's focus on the peaceful protesters, of which there have been many all around the world. Do you support their aims? Would you go out there? Have you been out there peacefully protesting, supporting some of the reforms that you mentioned earlier to do with, let's stop this from happening. Let's train police officers and things like that. So do you support the peaceful protests?
I support the right to protest. I support the right to peacefully protest. In the United States of America, we have the Constitution, which protects freedom of assembly and protest that are peaceful. It doesn't protect riots and all of the above. But the reason why I won't go out there, because I feel like the message is coming from a place of ignorance. It's not coming from a place of genuineness and wanting to actually see things change, because protesting is not going to accomplish anything. It's going to get people outraged. People are going to have a conversation. But if you want to actually fix something, you need to go down to the police department. You need to meet with the police chief. You need to meet with legislators so that they can pass laws and they can do stuff that can actually effectively change what's going on. But just running around with signs and yelling and walking down the street and marching, it makes people feel virtuous. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you're doing something. But that's not, in and of itself, is not going to actually change any policies. So I would rather join people in going down to the police department and having these conversations with the police chief, figuring out use of force policies, talking to legislators to figure out what laws can be changed. But here's another thing that strikes me, is that it appears from what I've seen that people don't want to have a genuine conversation. It's almost less about justice and more about revenge. It's almost more about pointing the finger at the police officer than saying, let's come together and actually do something on both sides. We can meet you in the middle, meet the police department in the middle, and let's make it happen. But until I see people actively doing that, I'm not going to go out and protest and waste my time.
I want to talk about a specific form of peaceful protesting, one which became popular a few years ago by, I believe, an American football player who would go on one knee whilst the national anthem was playing over in the States. Now, this action has been replicated all over the world. We've seen global leaders, Justin Trudeau, one of them, taking a knee. Many Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, recently doing it. We've seen the leader of the Labour Party, which is the leader of the opposition here in the UK, doing it. Have you taken the knee?
I have not. I will never take a knee. I will never in my life take a knee and disrespect our flag, disrespect our national anthem. I love my country. This country has done a lot for me, and this country has gotten much better and have improved. And I'm good with the improvement. And I think that we are working together, black, white, and everybody else, to do things greater in the future. I do not believe in. And now you have a right to protest, right? If the people in Congress. Now let me clarify this, because I think people are conflating the difference between the constitutional right to protest and then you're protesting on your job while you're under contract. I don't believe people in Congress should be taking a knee or doing any overt activism, because they're supposed to be impartial representatives of the people. So if they're not going to do something that represents, I don't know, people who believe in the Confederacy, people who are on the Republican side, they're not going to allow people to go up and beyond to support President Trump, then they shouldn't go up and beyond to support any cause. They should be impartial lawmakers. Also, for Colin Kaepernick. Now, if he wanted to take a knee in his front yard, or he wanted to take a knee on public property, that I think people would disagree with him, but nothing would happen against him. The problem is that Colin Kaepernick is taking a knee during a football game, and he's under contract, and there's an obligation by the NFL that you shall stand during the national anthem while it's being played. So in this country, you have a right to freedom of speech, but your right to freedom of speech, when you have agreed under contract, is no longer present. As a police officer, when I was in uniform, I could not do activism. I could not speak my own words while I'm in uniform. I was speaking on behalf of the Tucson Police Department. So, and Colin Kaepernick is a representative not of himself when he's playing for the San Francisco 49ers, but a representation of the team. And that's not a good look, and that's not a good business move for the NFL. When you're not a starting quarterback, you're not producing stats, and you're causing more chaos than you are success, then people are going to have a problem with that. And I think that that is legitimate in my personal opinion.
I want to talk about another sports star. I think he's called LeBron James. This is an NBA star. Now, I'm not really into basketball over in the States. I think it's pretty popular over there, not so much in the UK. But he's been in controversy recently where a Fox News anchor, Laura Ingraham, told him to basically shut up and go bounce a ball, I believe she told to him. And then he put out this tweet saying, I'm not going to shut up because people have been telling black people to shut up throughout all of history. Except, of course, when talking about China, I think the NBA was pretty silent then when they basically the Chinese regime came in and said, you shouldn't be criticizing us over Hong Kong. What do you make of that whole episode? Was it right for the Fox News presenter to say shut up to this NBA player?
Yeah, I mean, I think she has the freedom of expression and freedom of speech on air to say he should shut up and just dribble because he's not even speaking intelligently about politics. Now, he has the same right to get out and say she's wrong for saying that to him. So both parties have a right to express what they feel about one another. But the hypocrisy comes with LeBron James because he said nothing about China, said nothing about the protest there of inequality. I mean, that is the greatest sign of inequality and the people protesting to have something or to have life be better, similar to what he's claiming in the United States of America. So he completely disregards people in China, but he's advocating for people in America. People in China are really having problems. People in America, a lot of this is mythical. And the reason I say that is because LeBron James, as an example, at the age of 18, he signed a $19 million contract with Nike, and he has been a millionaire since he was 18. He is the most celebrated person in the United States of America, given maybe a few other people are beloved more than he is. But LeBron James have fans who are white, fans who are black. They spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars generated wearing his jerseys, getting his autographs. So his idea of oppression is slightly skewed when you look at actually what he goes through and what he represents. He is, in my personal opinion, subject of brainwashing. That's when people are telling you or are convincing you that you're oppressed, even though there's no oppression present. And in your mind, you start to see oppression everywhere, although it don't exist. At least it doesn't exist in his situation. There are elements of oppression that happens in all societies. And I believe black people do experience that to some degree.
We'll get on to that, the idea of oppression, white privilege, racism in a minute. I want to focus in on something you mentioned earlier. Obviously, you were in the police force and we were talking about taking a knee. And you mentioned that there are police officers taking a knee in America. And we've seen the same thing happening in the UK, where police officers in London decided to take a knee in solidarity with the protesters. And then about 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, the protesters actually went out and attacked those same police officers, throwing items at them and things like that. What's your message to police officers around the world who are thinking, they're on the front line at these protests, they're kind of worried about it becoming violent, and they think, well, actually, I agree with what these protesters are saying, I'm going to take a knee?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to laugh about the police officers in the UK getting attacked. I just think it's ironic, and it speaks volumes that they don't really want to combine forces. They don't really want to work together. They want you to bow down to them in a sign of defeat. That's pretty much what it is. And I would encourage any police officer around the country, don't bow down to the mob. Don't contradict your moral beliefs in order to appease another person, because as soon as you do that, they're going to stab you in the back. Also, as a police officer in the United States of America, you are to be impartial. You can't support activism for Colin Kaepernick. You can't support activism for President Donald Trump. When you're wearing the uniform and the badge, you are to be impartial. So you should be ashamed of yourself if you are now acting in a partisan way when you're supposed to be an impartial public servant. So in addition to not doing it because it's violating your oath, also don't bow down to the mob because it's never going to be enough for them.
Well, an interesting point about UK protests against police officers, which has been quite comical to some people, is that protesters have been coming up to police officers in the UK and shouting this phrase, "Hands up, don't shoot," which I believe was a phrase shouted by one of the black people in America who eventually was unfortunately killed by a police officer. Whereas police officers in the UK aren't actually armed. Well, at least I think 99% of them aren't armed. So I'm not quite sure what the protesters are worried about being shot at with. What's your message to people in the UK and around the world who have decided to go on Instagram and share their black squares? They've decided to go out protesting. They've decided to break social distancing rules and join gatherings. Because, I mean, you honestly wouldn't believe just how prolific this movement has become. I mean, even I, as someone 4,000 miles away in the UK, I can't go on my Instagram thing without seeing endless Black Lives Matter posts from people I grew up with who probably haven't read too much into the issues. So what's your message to people around the world who are thinking about protesting or sort of sharing their solidarity for the Black Lives Matter movement? Is it worth it?
Well, I will tell them to be informed first so you can actually be effective. If you're going around and you got hands up, don't shoot, that never happened. Michael Brown never had his hands up. It was investigated by our FBI, and it was also investigated locally. That never happened. Witnesses initially said that, and they lied about it, and they confessed in the court hearing, and they retracted their statement. So Michael Brown never had his hands up. There is not one person that was killed by police that we know of that ever had their hands up and was executed. So if you're going to go out and protest, you're going to go out and be an activist, at least be an accurate activist, because you want your activism to be taken seriously. You want it to actually work. And if you're going around saying hands up, don't shoot, nobody's going to take you serious beyond the crowd of people that you're around. Also, actually make your activism count. Putting a black square showing solidarity, it really does nothing. It may make someone feel good, but I have never in my life seen legislation pass because somebody put a square on their Instagram account. You need to know the facts and go out and find responsible ways to actually affect change. If your police department isn't even armed, then you shouldn't be having a conversation about armed police officers shooting people. You should be having conversations that's associated to your struggle. And you are not doing any favors, especially if you're overseas, and the same thing for people in America. You're not doing favors for any other country just because you're blindly following it. If you really wanted to do what's right in America, you would understand the principles of America, and then you would apply those and keep the principles consistent in your own country.
I think what's interesting is the main dividing line between the two groups of people, and obviously there are thousands of different views on George Floyd's death, but I think the main dividing line is this. Everyone agrees that George Floyd's death was tragic and unjust, and even you're saying there that the police officer shouldn't have done what he did, and that he will face the full force of the law if he broke the law. So the dividing line is this. The people out protesting, the people who support Black Lives Matter, this is what they say. They say the reason I'm doing this is because we live in a systematically racist country. We live in a systematically racist society. They point to the death of George Floyd. They point to the death of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and various other people over the years who have been killed by police. So do you believe that America, that Western society, is systematically racist?
No. I do not. And the reason I don't, because there's no evidence of it. And that's where the word systematic or systemic racism comes from, is because they can't point out an actual incident of racism or actual institution that is racist, pointing at individuals that we can actually go after and get them removed. Since they cannot do that, and most people do not have real experiences with racism and oppression, then they just say it's systematic or it's continual or systemic. Therefore, it takes the burden off of people having to actually do something about it and having to actually have someone that they can point the finger at and say, this is a racist, get him out, we can fix it. And that's the biggest problem that I have with these ideas, is that they can't point to any facts. They can't point to any reasonableness. I mean, I've been Black for 33 years of my life, ever since I was born. And I have never experienced oppression and racism in the United States of America. The problem with some of this is that people genuinely are having a emotional feeling and they feel like that they're oppressed. And a lot of it is psychological. When you're born into this world as a Black man in America, and other Black people are telling you that you're a victim and that you got to work twice as hard as white people and that white people are oppressing you, what is the first thing that you're going to think of when you see a white person? You're going to automatically look at them and say, this person is better than me, or they think they're better than me, or they have more opportunities than me. That's going to create animosity that really don't exist. And I think that if people would understand that and will do more research into that, I think that we could actually have a resolution to some of these things, and we could go on about building together in the United States of America.
I suppose those who disagree with you would say that America has a history of slavery, it has a history of Jim Crow laws. Only until relatively recently did Black people achieve equality under the law. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of racism in various parts of American society over hundreds of years. So therefore, this whole history of oppression, of slavery, of racism hasn't gone away, and it's still there. And there are people in America who obviously are racist. Therefore, our society is racist, and they might use statistics such as more Black people go to prison, or more Black people get arrested, or more Black people proportionally get stopped and frisked, or in the UK we call it stop and searched. So therefore, what do you say to all that evidence and the kind of idea that America was built on racism, built on slavery, and therefore it is still a racist and sort of racist society?
Yeah, I will push back and say, understand, and people should understand history, understand the facts of history. Slavery wasn't about race. Slavery wasn't even racist. Slaves came from Africa was the first available slave labor, and it was legal. Africans sold them to Europeans, who then utilized that legal slavery in the United States of America in the southern states. In the north, in the northern states, slavery was illegal. So not all Black people were slaves in this country, and not all white people owned slaves. It was a very small minority of whites who had enough money to actually own slaves. People are not realizing the facts of history, because the first legal slave owner in this country was a Black man named Anthony Johnson, who went to court and sued to own 2 other Black people for life. Also, there was hundreds of Black people in the South who owned Black slaves. Slavery and some of the divide, or I could say disparities between Black and white post-slavery, wasn't necessarily race, it was power. It came down to property ownership. And so there were Blacks who could vote. And see, people may not realize this, but Blacks had the ability to vote. The ability was taken away. Then it was re-given to Black people and established through the Constitution. So people don't realize that there was a point in time in this country where Blacks could vote and whites couldn't, because they weren't property owners. They weren't land owners. And if you know your history, you would know that. In early 1900s, which was pre the Civil Rights Movement, the first female millionaire to ever exist out of any race was a Black woman named Madam C.J. Walker. So there was a tremendous amount of Black people who were successful, but they tend to not even focus on them because they want to push an agenda. Now, America has had some disparities. Just because you see disparities doesn't necessarily mean it's discrimination. Thomas Sowell wrote a really good book explaining these things. So when you get down to incarceration, when you get down to police patrol of African-American people in this country, there are disparities. And those disparities are not rooted primarily in racism. They are rooted in culture. They are rooted in crimes being committed. Because if you look at the stats in the United States of America, African-American people make up between 12 to 13% of the population. The criminal element of the Black population is about, I don't know, I'm gonna give a rough estimate and I'm gonna be very conservative. I'll say about 7% of the population is male, and most males between 16 and 35 or 40 commit most of the crimes. So about 7% of the United States population commits half of the murders in the country. They commit over half of violent crimes. So when you look at that stat, you can see why police are patrolling inner city minority communities at a higher rate. and you can see why they're going to jail at a higher rate. When you commit disproportionate amount of crime, you are represented disproportionately in the criminal justice system and also in law enforcement interaction. So people need to root their arguments in facts and logic, and therefore we wouldn't be spending hundreds of years still talking about oppression. There is no law on the book in the United States of America that is oppressive to any one race. And in reality, it is illegal to be or act on racism in the United States of America, whether it's employment, whether it's violence. All of those things are deemed illegal in the United States of America. So it is somewhat of a myth to go down that path. But if people look at facts, they'll be more informed, and we can move together in a better way.
I want to ask my next question about what do you think the main difficulties are facing the black community in America, which are causing these differences between white and black people in incarceration and things like that. But first of all, I just want to focus in on one of the things that you just mentioned there, the idea that slavery isn't racist. I mean, I suppose maybe I don't know my history too well about black American slavery, but I don't think there were hundreds and thousands of white slaves over in America. And I think that, we can point to many, many white people in the United States throughout the history of slavery who believed that black people were inferior, and they would call them absolutely despicable names. So how can you possibly say that the whole idea of slavery, where basically, well, there may have been a few black slave owners, but I can't think of any white slaves. So how can you say that's not a racist concept?
Well, because if you look at history, when they settled in the United States of America, or at the time it wasn't the United States of America, but when they settled in North America, they attempted to enslave multiple different people. They tried to enslave the natives, and they were unsuccessful because natives knew the terrain, they knew the land, and they escaped. So they weren't able to get the natives to stick when it comes to slavery. And also they enslaved other whites. But the thing was that there wasn't enough slave labor in the white population, and they didn't fare well in the heat. They didn't fare well in those conditions. So they weren't able to productively use whites as slaves. There was a plethora of slave labor from Africa. And so that's why they went to Africa to get slaves. And slaves were dispersed from Africa all over the world. It wasn't just in the United States of America, what we know today as the United States of America. Actually, South America had a tremendous amount of slaves, probably 3 or 4 times as many slaves as the United States of America had. So in its inception, and I studied this in college, African American studies, in the inception of slavery had nothing to do with race. And I think people should know that. Now, there were people who began to discriminate against blacks because you were inferior. It wasn't just that they thought they were inferior. You were actually inferior when you look at the fact that you're a slave and that your slave master owns you. And you see, even during slavery, there was a lot less white people who murdered blacks during slavery because you were property. Now, when slavery was abolished is when we see lynching and we see other things like that. White people were lynched as well. Now, black people were lynched at a higher number than whites, but whites were lynched as well. So it wasn't just lynching, wasn't just a thing that was done to black people. So when you look at the history, you can see that the inception of slavery wasn't based on race. And here's another reason why it's not based on race is because they didn't just go to Africa and steal black people. It was an institution of slavery already established in Africa. And then the Africans sold black people all over the world, and they made a profit. So that's what my argument would be. There are levels of prejudice, and it created some racial elements in our country. But I don't think that was the driving factor. And you can see that by all of the black people who were successful, even right after slavery. And here's another thing that I think people are not realizing as well, is that there was a lot of diversity in slavery too. People always think of plantation slaves. That wasn't the only form of slavery. You had city slaves, you had slaves that did other things. They weren't just plantation slaves. Harriet Tubman, who is one of the most popular slaves at the time, who discovered or created the Underground Railroad to help slaves escape, people don't realize that she was married to a black man who was free, and they lived together. So she wasn't on the plantation. She was living with her husband, who was a free black man, when she escaped and created the Underground Railroad. So when you look at the totality of circumstances, you'll get a better picture if people actually knew the history of slavery. Not saying that there's no oppression or no racism that stemmed from that, but that wasn't the primary goal or the focus in slavery.
So obviously there was the Jim Crow laws. We can say, let's say the concept and the origins of slavery, let's say that wasn't to do with race, but to do with economics. But obviously further down the line, as I mentioned, you would have the Jim Crow laws, you would have segregation, and this was the whole point of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. Therefore, those I would say those incidents, those laws, are what people today would point to and say, well, actually, America was a racist country because it was enshrined in law in many states that black people were inferior.
I would push back on that because Jim Crow was in the South. It was a Southern thing. That's why they call it the Jim Crow South. They didn't have Jim Crow in the North. So people in the North weren't segregated, and there was not the same conflict as you saw in the South. And people have to realize this too. There were some racial components there, but it wasn't primarily rooted in racism, because you have to look at it like this. If you were a slave and now you are a free person, it is almost impossible for you to think that you're going to intermingle with the population who have enslaved you for 100 years. So I think, based on what I know from history, is that there was some racial component to it, but there was also a logical component that there didn't need to be a connection here, because you have two different people on two different sides. And even throughout history, there were black activists who did not want desegregation. Martin Luther King was criticized by many because he was a person who wanted to desegregate. He wanted blacks to be amongst whites and to be equal. There was a lot of black activists during his time period that didn't want equality. They wanted to be separate. And they agreed with separate but equal policies. And they felt like that blacks were developing their own, and they didn't have to get thrusted into a white society that didn't necessarily want to or effectively receive them. An example of that is when desegregation happened and you had black students going to white schools. Well, the black teachers didn't have a job at the white schools. So desegregation in some ways hurt Black America to a certain degree. And I'm gonna give you an example of how this works. Just say that you and I lived in a house together, and at one point in time, I lived in the outhouse in the back. I always say outhouse. I lived in the garage in the back, right? In the backyard. I had no access to the inside of the house. And over years, I began to build my garage up in the backyard, and I made it just like I wanted it. I had it the way I wanted it. I had the freedoms. I had availability, and you had your own space in the big house. Now, just imagine that one day you came to me and said, hey, I want you to tear down your house and come live in my house, right? So I'm gonna tear down everything I've built, everything that I know, everything I've established, to now come be a part of your house. And now I come into your house and I don't have anything that belongs to me. I don't have anything that I built. And I think that was somewhat of the conflict between Black people and white people in America when it came to desegregation. So it wasn't always rooted in racism, but it had a racial component to it due to the blacks being slaves and whites not being slaves. And if you look at it, there was diversity within the Black community as well, a hierarchy of people who were successful versus people who were poor. And all white people weren't equal either. You had white people who, in the country, when you look at in terms of outside of Jim Crow South, you had Black people doing much better than white people who were a part of indentured servitude versus whites who migrated here. So, I mean, I could get into a full spectrum of it, but I think people need to have a more broad perspective and say there were some racism there. There were racial components, but it wasn't just all racism, and it wasn't just rooted in racism.
Well, look, I think it's really important to have nuanced discussions about history. So I'm glad that you've talked about these issues. I just want to ask one last question about the history, because I don't want to get too caught up in about a history lesson. I'm sort of a bit more interested in what's going on today, but it's really important, as you say, to talk about the nuances and to talk about what actually happened. So just on that last point there, you're talking about the analogy to do with, you having your own home and I having my own home. Do you think that, based on that analogy, do you think that it was right that Black people and white people were desegregated?
Yes, I do believe so, but I almost think, and this is my personal opinion, I almost think that it may have happened too soon. I really do think that it could have been better if Black people would have had an opportunity to establish more of a foundation before desegregation. Because when desegregation happened, is when you've seen a lot of conflict between black and white people. You see a lot of black people get murdered in the South. And think about it, this was the South. This wasn't the North. But in the South, you saw a lot of black people get murdered. You saw a lot of injustice. You saw a lot of discrimination. You saw a lot of racism, because now you are in a white-owned world, and there's no place there. And then you saw it begin to unravel slowly but surely. But there was a lot of black people that took the brunt of the initial meshing before we start to see black people introduced into sports, black people introduced into other elements. And then now today, we're completely enveloped into society. So I think that it was necessary to happen for sure. I just think that black people needed a little more time to establish. So therefore, when the mesh happened, black people didn't completely crumble and fall apart and be subject to white leadership. They could have had some foundation here, and they could have had something to fight with.
I suppose in a way that leads on to my next question. If it's not racism, if we're not living in a racist society, in a racist country, what are the main issues facing the black community today? And why do these disparities, why do these differences between white and black people occur?
Well, I think a lot of it is political. There's a political agenda. There's a political party, and I believe it's the Democratic Party, that keeps pushing division, because if they push division, they push issues, now they're the cure. It's almost like giving people cancer and then also owning the place that does chemo. That's exactly what the Democratic Party is doing. There are racist people in our country. There will forever be racist people in our country. And it's not just white people. There are racist black people. There are racist Hispanic. There's racist Asians. There's a plethora of people who are, to the end of time, will be racist. The problem is that the political side pushes an agenda through media, through movies, through education, the education system, that keeps a lie going, and people believe the lie. In our society, it's more about finances. It's more about economic success. It's more about generational wealth than it is that has most to do with your race. Because if you look at black Americans and you look at black Africans who come to America and migrate to America, there's a huge divide in success. And a lot of that comes down to culture, because Africans who migrate here have a more sustainable culture, and they do much better than African Americans who are here. So in that sense, you could tell that it's not necessarily just color, because therefore discrimination and systematic oppression should affect both parties the same. Asian Americans in this country have done a tremendous amount or have had a tremendous amount of success over black people and others. You're talking about education, you're talking about graduation, you're talking about finances. Per capita, Asian people in America do much better, even than whites. A lot of this comes down to culture. And you look at black culture from the 60s to now, single parent homes were at 22%. Now we're looking at 73%. That is a huge functionality change that causes the deficits that we see in the culture, that we see in black America. When you talk about economic success, I have personally seen that black people are not educating themselves enough on economic success and how to pass generational wealth down. It seems that black people, and it could be because of some things that happen in America, I'm not going to discard that, but at the end of the day, you're still accountable for your own intelligence. But we don't pass down wealth like other cultures do. We make millions as basketball players and artists, and we bring so much to this country, but yet we live like we're living in the moment. And so therefore we drive $1 million cars and have 15 houses and all of these things, but not generating or looking forward to economic success. So I think, in short, it's more about culture than it's less about race. And I think people blend the two, and that's how the political parties stay in power.
What is Brexit?
Brexit is literally, and you know, I guess the name in itself is the black exit from the Democratic Party. But the mission of Brexit is less about politics, absolutely almost nothing about politics, and more about having a free mind, being a free thinker, being able to think for yourself and not following the one-way thinking just because you're black. And it's not about voting for Democrat, Republican. That stuff is irrelevant. It's about figuring out what's best for you and your community and running with that instead of running with the monolithic thought that we've seen prevalent in the United States of America in the Black community.
One of the issues that gets mentioned a lot over recent years is the idea of white privilege. Now, obviously, those watching this video can see that I'm white, and I think only I know my own experiences. Only I know the things that the experiences that I've been through. Yet many would say that because of the colour of my skin, I have certain advantages over people who are black or Asian or whatever in the UK, or in if I was a white person in America, I'm sure they would say the same thing. So, do I have white privilege? Do I have advantages over you because I'm a white man?
Yeah, I wouldn't know, right? Because I don't walk in your shoes. I don't know what privileges you have. I don't know how you grew up. I don't know any of that. And that's information I need to know to determine if you have privilege. And even if I knew your upbringing, then I have to compare it to my upbringing. So, and then I have to walk in your shoes to know if you are getting advantages that I'm not getting. So I think white privilege is, like I said, it's a political term that's rooted to keep division in this country. I personally think anyone who claims to have white privilege or that's accepting their white privilege, it is racist against Black people. And here is why. Because you are asserting, without knowing me, without knowing how hard I work, without knowing my family history or the value of my family name, to say that you are better than me and that you will experience life better than me, you will have more opportunities than me. And to me, that's projecting something just based on my race. And for Black people to project it on white people is the same level of racism, meaning that I don't know where you come from. I don't know how hard you've worked to get to where you are, but because you are white, not because of the facts or not because your history, but because you are white alone, I'm presenting that you are better than me or you are treated better than me. And I'm also alluding to the fact that other white people in this country have to be racist because they are going to treat you better than me. And I don't even know those people. I'm only basing it on the color of their skin. That's the definition of racism. There is no pervasive white privilege in the United States of America. There are white people who have privilege. Yeah, if you're a Rothschild or something like that and you happen to be white, you have a privilege. Some of it has to do with your finances. Now, LeBron James has more privilege than any white person in the United States of America. He really does. He can go anywhere and people will worship him. So it's not a fair argument or a consistent argument to say that every white person has white privilege. There are Black people that have privileges too, like affirmative action, like they have scholarships for Black-owned businesses, which I'm going to take full advantage of it if I can. But they have Black-owned business grants and different things for African-American people. And they don't say you have to have come from a poor background. You have to have come from poverty. They don't have that prerequisite. Just because you're Black, you get to take advantage of things that can drive economic success for you. So I think that white privilege is a BS term created by politicians to cause division, and it does nothing good for the common man to come together and unite.
It's an interesting term, and I suppose for myself as a white person, and it sort of frustrates me because people, as I mentioned earlier, people have no idea anything that I've been through in my life. And I'm not a victim, but we've all been through hardships. I don't think I've ever met anyone who hasn't been through some terrible experience or some kind of setback that is absolutely awful and you wouldn't want inflicted on anyone. But people say to me, because of, let's say, the way I speak or the colour of my skin, that I therefore must have only been in the position that I am now because of those things, which I think, as you say, it creates division in that sense. And obviously it frustrates you because it feels like, well, you're saying that because you're white, you're better than me. How have we got to a situation where people are saying, I have white privilege, and that white people's opinions on race discussions are less acceptable because they haven't experienced racism? From, we're at that point now, whereas Martin Luther King, as you mentioned earlier, he believed that everyone should be treated equally and it shouldn't matter what colour skin you have, and we should live in a colourblind society. How have we got from that fantastic idea to today where I'm accused of having white privilege?
See, I believe that it comes down to the lack of God. See, people don't believe in God like they used to. Martin Luther King was a Christian man. And in God's kingdom, there is no race. We're all God's children. We're all equal in God's eyes. So if you realize that, which is what Martin Luther King was alluding to, then you wouldn't have these problems with projecting privilege on people without even knowing their stance. Here's the hypocritical thing. Black people often say, you don't know what it's like to be black because you're not black. Yet they assume what it's like to be white, although they're not white. And that is tremendously hypocritical. And I believe, like I said, it's stimulated from politics that got us to this point because they never want us to unite. This is another factor where we can never unite, because you and I don't know your history, but you and I could have had the same upbringing. Then, therefore, if we do, we can identify with one another and we can say, you know what? Hey, brother, we're in this together. You had minor setbacks and so have I. Let's work together and let's build. But they can't have that happen, because then nobody would need politicians. So they need you to feel, or for me to feel, because you may not agree with white privilege, but if I feel like you have white privilege, then now I cannot find a connection with my brother. Now I have to find odds and look at a difference that may be manufactured, that's not even really authentic.
That's a really good way of putting it. I think that, yeah, that's really interesting. Should we defund the police?
No, that is the worst idea that I've ever heard in my life. And they try to make an excuse now. See, they were chanting, defund the police. Minneapolis Police Department want to completely abolish the police. That's exactly what they're shooting for. They want to abolish the police and replace the police, in my opinion, with something similar to the KKK, something similar to Antifa, or what we call the brown shirts that we've seen in Nazi Germany. This is exactly what they want to do, because police are impartial. They want to replace them with a mob that's going to activate laws based on political agendas, because the police are functional. There's probably almost 1 million police officers in the United States of America, thousands of different agencies. And all you can claim is that there was 9 African-American people shot unarmed in 2019 out of 44 million black people. When you do the math, it's like 0.000006%. You have more of a chance getting struck by lightning than being killed by the police officers. But they want to disband the police department real quickly. People don't realize that the police department is a part of the justice system. So if you get rid of the police department, then you have abolished the justice system. The police department are legislators create laws, police enforce the laws, and the judges, they make sure that your constitutional rights are being followed and that you have due process. So all of that works together. You eliminate the police, then what do you have? You have nobody to enforce the law. Police are not only involved in potentially taking deadly force or using deadly force against individuals, but they're there to do proactive policing, preventative crimes, arresting people who are drunk driving so that they can run over people and kill them, addressing people who are speeding so that they don't get into a traffic accident and kill people on the freeway. They are addressing people who are on the internet, adult people on the internet looking at children, if you know what I mean. We address everything as a police agency, and it's invaluable to use police agencies. Also, terrorism. If you have terroristic threats or you have things that happen domestically, police officers are the ones who respond to that, i.e. 9/11, i.e. post nightclub. Police are the ones that respond, not our military. So if you are going to go down the path of defunding or trying not to have police be around, you're running into a problem. And lastly, defunding, if you didn't want to abolish, you want to cut the funding, that makes police officers worse. Because are you going to cut the funding for training? Police officers need more training. They need more access to less lethal weapons. They need more training. They need more scenario-based things that cost money. Therefore, they can be better and proactive in the community.
I want to talk a bit about your life and your career. Now, I have to admit, the first time I've actually seen you live speak at an event a couple of years ago at one of these Turning Points event. I was really interested where you were coming from. So, and this is really interesting also to talk about the issues now. So you were obviously a police officer for a while. Can you talk about your experiences there? Did you see a systemically racist police department? Did you experience racism? Were all these cops, these white cops going after black people? How long were you a police officer, and what was that experience like?
So I was a police officer for about 6.5 years. I did everything on the police department. I was the spokesperson of the police department. I was a field training officer, meaning that I trained officers how to become officers in the field. I also was a general instructor. I trained officers at the academy. I was on the SWAT team, Special Weapons and Tactics. So I had the tactical perspective on the police department. So I did a whole bunch of different things. I had tremendous amount of commendations. I was a cop's cop, in my personal opinion. Many would probably agree with me. So I've had that tremendous amount of experiences. I have never seen a racist police officer. I've never talked to one. I don't even know one. And I was on the department primarily white and Hispanic police officers. Never seen it. Now, I see police officers who may be racially insensitive, and that's not against the law, and that's not any fault of their own. If you don't grow up in a certain culture, then you're not going to know the cultural dynamic. So Hispanic officers tend to do well in Hispanic communities. One reason some of them knew Spanish, and also they knew the cultural dynamic of the Hispanic community. Therefore, they fit in better. Same thing with white and black communities. I did well in the black community where I patrolled is because not only did they identify with me based on my skin, but I understood the cultural dynamics in the black community. So I never seen any racist cops, but I've seen some cops that may not be culturally updated, but none of which was criminal and none of which was discriminatory. So I think that based on my experience, I've never seen any of that.
Let's talk about the death of David Dorn. Now, he was a police officer for 38 years, really outstanding guy in his community, really well respected. Unfortunately, he was killed by a rioter last week when defending a jewellery shop. And there have been several of these deaths during the protests, during the riots, during the looting. Why do we not remember his name? Why do we not go out and shout his name at protests, whereas we do with George Floyd?
Well, two things. These protesters and rioters have killed more people in the rioting than police in the last 2 years. So they're counterproductive in and of itself. But the reason why we will never talk about, now I will and others, but the reason why the mainstream media will not cover this, the reason why they'll never get a t-shirt, there'll never be a mural with David Dorn's name and face on it, is because they don't really care about Black lives. They care about an agenda. And the agenda only applies when a Black man dies at the hands of a police officer, a white police officer, whether it's justified or not. That's the only agenda. Because David Dorn and 9 other Black people have died in these protests. And they're all, based on what I know, were all unjustifiable except one. The guy tried to break into a jewelry store, break into somebody's property, he ended up getting killed. But the rest of them, I think, were unjustified murders by thugs who were protesting the death of George Floyd. So they don't care about Black lives. Because if they did, we would be marching 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just in Chicago alone. So this is another reference point and the reason why I don't have much respect for Black Lives Matter and any of these activists.
As a former police officer, how does it make you feel with your colleagues being attacked, with, as you say, as we mentioned earlier, people calling for the defunding of the police? How does that make you feel? Does it make you angry?
It makes me tremendously angry, disappointed, sad, frustrated. I mean, I can go down a list of what it makes me feel, none of which makes me feel happy. It's a shame. It's a shame what's going on in this country. All over stuff most people are ill-informed. I know what police officers do on a day-to-day basis. I know the sacrifice. I've sacrificed firsthand. I know the things that we see on duty. I know the drama, the crimes, the lives we save. I know all of that firsthand. The public does not. So to paint every police officer with a broad brush is heartbreaking to me. And police officers are actually getting murdered in the process, unjustifiably, just because they're police officers, all on a false narrative. So I personally, and I spoke to a police officer today, I'm going to do my best to give police officers a voice, not only on my social media, but I want to give them a voice by having rallies, having special events for police officers, donating to police officers, police organizations, because we need the other side of it. I completely stand against any bad police officer. Everybody in the country, everybody in America, everybody in the UK, everybody. I mean, not unless you are evil devil, nobody supports bad policing in America. Nobody supports bad policing in general or police officers who are bad. But we do support the overwhelming majority of positive, great heroes in our country that wear the badge.
I want to ask one more question, and I think it's a great opportunity for you to explain to people or to give your point of view who would disagree with you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are millions of people, young people all around the world who think that We live in a racist society, that police brutality is an epidemic. Believe that police officers in the UK, the US are racist and are killing black people. They're happy to go out and protest and things like that. And even if you're a black person anywhere in the UK or America, you might believe that you're being oppressed. So what's your message to these people who think, well, actually, we live in a racist society, we've got to go out there, we've got to go and protest, we've got to make sure the police is either defunded or reformed or whatever. Can you just give your, you've been doing it throughout this whole interview, but I really want you to speak to those people and just say what your view is of those issues.
Yeah, I would tell them to slow down, just slow down. Operate in love and compassion. Slow down, look at the facts. And we can't get anything accomplished unless we all do it together. So look at the facts. The facts will lead you down the path of believing that it's a very, very rare occasion that police are doing things that are unjust. They're doing things like killing people for no reason. So once we get that conclusion settled, let's all come together, black, white, no matter what you are. No matter if you're in UK or in the United States, let's come together. Let's have an honest conversation about things that we all want to see change. And let's actively, proactively go forth and make those things happen. So, but the biggest thing is just slow down for a minute. Don't let your emotions overtake you. Allow facts to proceed, because then we can actually get things accomplished. And when you quote someone like Martin Luther King, just make sure you understand his argument. His argument was very clear that he had a dream that one day people will be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. Police officers are not exempt. We should be judging police officers. We should be judging people in the community by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And if Martin Luther King was alive today, he'd probably say not the color of their uniform.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for joining us. And we'd love to have you on again. That was a fantastic interview. If people want to watch this interview series, they can go into the link in description below. We do an interview every single week. We've got some fantastic guests lined up. So as I say, thank you so much, Brandon, for joining us.
And thanks for having me.
Great.